Alrighty, how are you doing? Today, what we're going to get going into now, this time is subtracting integers. So take a look at the top of your notes. Make sure it matches with what is projected up here that we're subtracting integers. And here we go. All right. Do you know what the highest point on Earth is? Let alone what the altitude is there? Well, if you were guessing Mount Everest, yep, you happen to be right. And 29,028 feet above sea level. Think about that for a second, because there are 5,280 feet in a mile. So this isn't quite 6 miles, more than 5 miles, less than 6 miles, straight up above the ground. Wow, that's an incredible amount. All right, let's counteract this. Do you know what the lowest point on Earth is? Are you thinking someplace like Death Valley or something? That is below sea level. You're correct. In fact, parts of New Orleans are below sea level as well. But I want you to think water and down in the ocean, because that's actually where the lowest point is. Got a guess? Have you ever heard of this? This is called the Mariana Trench, and it is located in the Pacific Ocean here. If you take a peek at this map, it's kind of north of Australia, kind of south and east of China and Indonesia. It's kind of up this way. So the deepest part there is 35,800 feet below sea level. That's not quite 7 miles. Okay. Holy cow. That would mean if it were possible to do this, we could like saw off Mount Everest, turn it upside down, stick it in the Mariana Trench, and there would still be over a mile of water before you'd get up to the surface. Wow. Well, below and above sea level are a great example of talking about integers. Integers are all the whole numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all their opposites, so all the negatives as well. And this is a great way to think about this. Okay, so you got Mount Everest here, way up above sea level. Here's the ocean. And then you have this very deep, deep part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. This is kind of like a negative number because it's below the surface of the water here. So if I just have some kind of gauge here, that looks kind of like a temperature thermometer gauge or something, and think above here somewhere you get to a level that's 29,028 feet above sea level. Here's 0, we'll call that sea level. And then down here somewhere would be the deepest part of the ocean, which is the Mariana Trench, and I'm going to call that negative. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you, how far is it between these two? We're actually finding the difference. And the difference is a word that implies subtraction. So we would take 29,028 feet and subtract this negative 35,840 feet. Now that looks kind of odd, doesn't it? Minus and then this negative value. Really, let's come over here and look here. I know that the distance from here to here is 29,028 feet. And then I know this distance here, even though this is a negative value, the distance there is 35,840. And so really, I know I just add these two together. You're right, because you should get something like 60, blah, 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 okay? When I look here, this minus a negative, perhaps you've seen this last year. When you subtract a negative number, really what we're doing here is we're adding these two together, and we're taking the 29,028, and let me bump this up because it might be getting lost here, adding this 35,840 and coming up with 64,868 feet. That's the total distance between the tip of the mountain to the bottom of the ocean. So subtracting a negative really means adding. How does that work? Well, I have something to share with you now. And you really have to promise. You see, I couldn't tell you this before. We couldn't tell you this in 4th or 5th grade, because you just couldn't handle it. You couldn't handle the truth. But I'm here to tell you what the truth is. And you have to promise you're not going to ruin this for your younger brother or sister or any younger family member that you've got. Don't dispel this. But the truth is, we got to bust this myth. Subtraction. It really doesn't exist. Now, we taught you something called subtraction so that would represent this idea of take away and things. But really, subtraction doesn't exist. Do you know what it is? It's addition in disguise. That's really what it is. And it's addition in disguise because really, every single subtraction problem is adding the opposite. And adding is always way easier than subtraction anyway. So my goodness, that's what we want to do. Every single time you see a subtraction problem, I want you to think of this. You keep that first number the same, you change it to add the opposite. Keep the first number and add the opposite. Subtraction is add the opposite. Okay, here we go. What do I mean by that? If I said like -7 minus 4, okay, and you're looking at that like, ugh. Yeah, well, here's what's really going on. Subtraction means we're going to take this and add the opposite of 4. The opposite of 4 is -4. This first number in front, that stays the same. We keep that first number. We say add the opposite, add the opposite. Now, -7 plus -4, that's what we did before. Psh, piece of cake, no problem. Let's try a few more. We just did this one, so now let's take a look at 8 minus -5. 8 minus -5 means 8. We're going to make this addition because every subtraction problem is adding the opposite. The opposite of -5 is 5. This equals 13. That's it. -6 minus -3. -6, keep that first one. We're going to add the opposite. And the opposite of -3 is +3. So then you take a look at this and say, -6 plus 3. Oh, that's just -3. Yes, 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 yes. 3 minus -6. That means keep the first number, rewrite subtraction as add the opposite. What? Yes, that's just equal to 9. -4 minus 1. That means write -4, and instead of subtracting 1, think of, whoops, I shouldn't have circled that one. Change it to add the opposite. -1 is the same as adding -1. That gives you a final value of -5. -7 minus -8. Keep the first number. Change it to adding the opposite. Okay, now -7 plus 8, that becomes +1. Boom. You will then also start to see some where you have an algebraic expression and we'll say substitute a value for the variable. 8 minus j, except instead of writing j, we're going to substitute -6 for j. Okay, now see what happens here? Oh, think of subtraction as adding the opposite. Your final value here is 14. Look at this one. -5 minus r. -5 minus, well, r is -2. Ta-da! -5. Instead of subtract, I want you to think of this as adding the opposite. The opposite of -2 is 2. -5 plus 2 is -3. Ta-da! That, my friends, is why subtraction doesn't exist. every subtraction problem you can think of as adding the opposite. All right, check Schoology. Your assignment will be listed there. And as always, may the force